December 7, 1941 marked an absolute turning point for Britain. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into the global conflict. But the situation was way more complex than it seemed. American public opinion was burning with outrage against Tokyo, not Berlin. Roosevelt faced a considerable political dilemma. Convincing Congress to declare war on Germany looked like an impossible task, despite the fact that previous agreements between the Anglo-American Joint Chiefs had established a Germany-first strategy. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Germans, calculating that confrontation with the United States was inevitable, decided to take the initiative and declared war themselves. This German decision was a monumental relief for London. For Britain, which had been resisting practically alone for over 2 years, American entry represented the difference between annihilation and survival. Even with General Rommel wreaking havoc in North Africa, the Soviet Union teetering on the edge of collapse, and southern England still under constant bombardment, Churchill's war aim of total victory stopped looking like a pipe dream. In 1945, both the American and British empires emerged as decisive victors of the conflict. However, behind the victory parades and peace conferences, a far more subtle battle was being waged between diplomats and politicians. This invisible battle would determine which of the two empires would rise as the sole global hegemon of the era that was about to begin. Churchill expected all disputes with Washington would vanish once the alliance was sealed. He was dead wrong, because what the United States demanded in return for its help was about to shake the very foundations of the British Empire. American diplomats didn't waste any time. Even before the final Lend-Lease agreement was signed, Washington started pressing relentlessly for a firm commitment on abolishing imperial preference. This modest tariff system protected the empire from outside competition, but to the United States, it represented an unacceptable obstacle on their path toward global commercial domination. Article 7 of the agreement demanded an explicit commitment to end any form of trade discrimination within the empire. Churchill and his cabinet protested vigorously against what they considered a blatant intervention in the empire's internal affairs. Tension escalated until the State Department, aware they were pushing too hard too fast, offered a calculated compromise. They assured London that, for the moment, Article 7 didn't imply specific commitments about imperial preference. With these promises in mind, on February 23, 1942, the Mutual Aid Agreement was signed. But signing the agreement didn't settle the debate permanently. Throughout the entire war, American public opinion swung erratically against continued assistance whenever rumors surfaced about supposed British treachery. Alarming stories circulated that London was using Lend-Lease goods to undercut American manufacturers in Latin American markets. Hopkins, one of Roosevelt's top advisors, proposed that British exports be limited to historical specialties like whiskey and Harris tweed fabrics. The British economists sent to negotiate, John Maynard Keynes, responded with sarcasm, suggesting they might consider adding haggis to the list. The U.S. Treasury was especially determined to ensure the aid provided was the bare minimum necessary for Britain to continue the war without rebuilding its actual strength or power. Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, hoped to restrict Lend-Lease to a strictly defined list of war materials, with the British going back to paying cash for goods like sugar, fish, and paper. The strategy would ensure London's gold and dollar reserves stayed permanently low and Britain remained permanently weak. Whitehall was saved from this predicament thanks to Cordell Hull, who saw Britain as a key piece of his future plan for a United Nations, which required London to be strong enough to take some independent action. Hull allowed knowledge of the Treasury's objectives to go public, which once again led Churchill to protest vigorously on behalf of the alliance. Roosevelt, valuing the stability of the coalition, squashed Morgenthau's agenda. Even American diplomats like Dean Acheson were pissed off at the Treasury's activities, which in his view envisioned a victory where both enemies and allies ended up flat on their backs. Enemies through military action, allies through bankruptcy. But this economic pressure was just the beginning. What Washington had planned for the British Empire in the coming years would make these initial disputes look insignificant. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how the United States weaponized economic aid as a geopolitical tool, because what's coming reveals the most aggressive strategy Washington deployed against its own ally during the war. It's worth making a revealing comparison at this point. The Soviet Union was also a Lend-Lease recipient after its invasion in June 1941. Roosevelt authorized a massive order of material and $1 billion in credit. In return, the United States demanded absolutely nothing. The irony is devastating. Liberal Great Britain was effectively driven into poverty by Washington as the price for its survival, while one of the most atrocious tyrannies ever to stain the earth couldn't have gotten better treatment. The reality behind this apparent paradox wasn't about ideology. Moscow literally couldn't offer the United States anything more than resisting Germany in the short term. The British Empire, on the other hand, had the collective fruits of an imperial project dating back centuries, ripe for the taking. Framing this as a total American looting of Britain in its moment of need, however, isn't remotely accurate and might go too far. After all, it wasn't America's fault that London had gotten itself into such a desperate predicament, and Washington was well within its rights to demand concessions, even if they were strict, in exchange for what was an enormous amount of economic aid. This aid would eventually reach something like $22 billion that wouldn't have to be paid back. However, it's also true that American diplomats didn't hide their hope that the British Empire would be liquidated at the end of the war, or preferably even sooner. This wasn't just a matter of realpolitik and geopolitical competition. Anti-colonial sentiment ran deep in the American mind. In October 1942, the editors of Life magazine addressed an open letter to the people of England. One thing we are sure about is that we are not fighting to hold the British Empire together. We don't like to put the matter so bluntly, but we don't want you to have any illusions. Churchill responded a month later in his famous Mansion House speech. Let me make this clear. We mean to hold our own. I have not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. The degree to which British and American diplomats were talking past each other on this issue was almost absurd. Americans struggled to grasp why Britain wanted to cling to what they considered relics of a bygone era. The British tended to be genuinely incredulous at what they perceived as American hypocrisy, considering the country's own problems. The more I hear, Lord Halifax wrote, referring to the treatment of African Americans in some parts of the United States, the more I resent criticism of us in India. American hostility toward the empire wasn't just a popular view, but one that reached the highest echelons of power. Throughout the war, Roosevelt was particularly interested in promoting Indian independence and the return of Hong Kong to China. I don't want to be unkind or rude to the British, but in 1841, when they acquired Hong Kong, they didn't acquire it by purchase, Roosevelt told Colonial Secretary Oliver Stanley in 1945. Let me see, Mr. President, Stanley shot back. That was about the time of the Mexican War, wasn't it? But while Churchill and Roosevelt debated the empire's future, a series of military disasters was about to fundamentally shift the balance of power between both nations. The first months of the Anglo-American alliance were ones of absolute and uninterrupted disaster for Britain. With the U.S. Pacific Fleet temporarily paralyzed, the Japanese swept through East Asia like an unstoppable tide. Washington's Philippine Protectorate was overwhelmed along with several smaller outposts. These were significant blows to America's Far East Empire, but hardly disastrous for its long-term prospects. For the British, it was a completely different story. The fall of Hong Kong was followed by the collapse of a chain of British possessions. The most disastrous of all was Singapore, described as London's Gibraltar of the East. The defeat shattered myths of British invincibility that had been cultivated for decades. Perhaps more importantly, it broke the confidence colonial governments had in London's ability to guarantee their security. Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom, Prime Minister John Curtin announced. The collapse of Britain's Pacific position meant American commanders there treated their war effort with contempt, perhaps not unjustly at first.
When the U.S. Navy turned the tide later that year at Midway, commanders and politicians alike saw a potential opportunity in British defeat. With the likelihood that the United States would have to reconquer European colonial possessions, they hoped to return them to the British on the basis of trusteeships. In effect, the British would only re-establish control with a commitment to the colony's independence. For the most part, this was successfully resisted by British diplomats, aided enormously by the fact that the imperial war effort improved over time, particularly with the series of decisive victories against the Japanese in Burma. In the end, the British wouldn't lose a single colony in the Pacific or anywhere else in the final peace settlement. But American hostility toward London's continued rule in the region, especially in India, was crystal clear. There was more cooperation in the Western theaters. For most of 1942, only Britain had serious forces in the field against Germany and Italy, though they met with disaster at the Siege of Tobruk. Churchill, who received the news while sitting next to Roosevelt, later described the impact he felt. In this moment of crisis, the president was generous. "What can we do to help?" the prime minister wrote about Roosevelt's simple question. Logistical challenges meant a serious Axis threat toward Egypt and the Suez Canal was always unlikely, but Roosevelt's assistance at the lowest point of Britain's war effort was genuine, even if the American ambassador in Cairo was privately scathing about what he called British fumbling. The tide of the African campaign turned decisively in October at El Alamein, while the Americans followed this up by undertaking their first major ground action in the West with Operation Torch. By mid-1943, North Africa and the Middle East were secure. But if the military contest with the Axis in the region was over, the diplomatic contest between the Allies had barely begun. And it was precisely at this moment of military victory when the United States launched its most devastating attack on the British Empire, not with weapons, but something far more powerful. Smash that subscribe button if these diplomatic moves are blowing your mind, because the most shocking decision and the gravest consequences for Britain haven't arrived yet. What comes next changed the global economic order forever.
While the campaign to liberate Europe was underway, another battle was unfolding across the Atlantic in the smoke-filled rooms of the Mount Washington Hotel. The official objective of the meeting between 44 nations, known as the Bretton Woods Conference, was to devise a post-war financial order that would guarantee global stability. The subtext was a duel between British and American diplomats over who would benefit from that order. The main protagonists were Harry Dexter White from the U.S. Treasury and Britain's celebrity economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was undoubtedly one of the smartest men on either side of the Atlantic. His wit and eloquence could have made him a master diplomat if he hadn't been, in Ben Styles' words, more concerned with humiliating than converting his opponent. Keynes's plan for the post-war financial order was complex but ingenious. International transactions would be settled through a new international clearing bank. Neither national central banks nor the International Clearing Bank would actually hold foreign currency. Instead, national banks would buy and sell their own currencies to each other through credits and debits denominated in newly created bank money in their clearing account. Keynes later called this bank money Bancor. Bancor would have a fixed exchange rate with all member currencies and gold. Members would add Bancor to their account by exporting and have Bancor subtracted by importing, though limits would be placed on the amount of Bancor a country could accumulate through a trade surplus and on the amount of Bancor debt it could rack up through trade deficits. Each country's quota would be set proportionally to its percentage of world trade. It wasn't incidental that this method of setting Bancor quotas was convenient for British interests, since Britain had little gold but needed to conduct a lot of trade. Keynes's opponent was the relatively unknown Harry Dexter White, a competent and effective member of the U.S. Treasury. Though generally Keynesian in economics, he was hugely sympathetic to the Soviet experiment and almost certainly arranged for confidential U.S. documents to find their way into Moscow's hands. White believed much of America's economic malaise in the 1930s had been caused by competitive currency devaluations by Britain and France.
Consequently, perhaps the key part of White's plan was establishing a fixed exchange rate. He hopes to elevate the dollar to the world's only gold substitute currency, so that cross-border gold movements would no longer have the power to dictate changes in U.S. monetary policy. This would be set entirely at the discretion of American experts and then transmitted to the rest of the world via the fixed exchange rate. Keynes had a card that could have saved everything, but what he did next was one of the costliest diplomatic blunders in history. The crux of the whole debate was that White wanted to make the US dollar, and only the dollar, synonymous with gold, while Keynes resisted the idea and how it would permanently undermine the pound sterling. Most of the issues related to the new system had been agreed upon before the conference was even convened, but on the key points still unresolved, particularly the question of linking dollars to gold, it's clear Keynes played a bad hand badly and was tactically outmaneuvered by White. Keynes's predicament during the 2 years of prior negotiations and then during the conference was unenviable. The reality was that Britain depended on American financial aid and would certainly come out of the war with a huge dollar shortage, which meant a loan from the U.S. government was the only way to keep the country afloat until exports recovered. Therefore, it was thought Britain really had very little leverage in the negotiations. However, tantalizingly, there was another possibility. Wall Street, spooked by the proposed new monetary policies, was prepared to lend up to $5 billion to Britain if it walked away from Bretton Woods. This loan would probably come with stricter economic terms than Britain could get from the U.S. government, but it would also come with no geopolitical strings attached. Crucially, it would have allowed British diplomats to outmaneuver White by threatening to walk away from the conference. Without British cooperation, there'd be no new international financial architecture, and White's plans to leave the United States economically supreme would stall out. A smart diplomat would have used Wall Street's offer to get the best deal possible, but Keynes, partly because he was now too personally committed to the new financial architecture, refused to even consider it. He acknowledged that doing so meant his negotiations at Bretton Woods and for a post-war loan would probably be tough, writing, "There are quarters in the United States that mean to use the grant of post-war credits to us as an opportunity to force on us the American conception of an international economic system." By this, he meant the abolition of imperial preference and exchange controls, along with the enthronement of the dollar at the top of the international monetary system. His rival White was at the forefront of such quarters, yet Keynes flatly refused the obvious alternative of standing up to the Treasury and borrowing privately. Thus, while the British delegation demanded countries be able to set their own exchange rates, the American vision, arguing for fixed rates, won. Keynes opposed the dollar being a gold-convertible currency, which in practical terms meant the pound sterling would be permanently usurped, while the United States, by issuing a currency as good as gold, would reap the benefits of countries wanting to hold vast dollar reserves. Again, the British protested vigorously. Again, White simply ignored Keynes and stuck the clause in anyway. The refusal to contemplate walking away meant Bretton Woods is hard to describe as even a duel between the United States and Britain. It was obvious who was going to win, and Keynes was just one more international delegate to be placated. The American victory at Bretton Woods still wasn't the end of the financial game between both sides of the Atlantic. With the war in Europe clearly coming to an end in the fall of 1944, the question of Lend-Lease came up once again. Keynes was deployed again to negotiate the second stage of the agreement, which would cover Britain between victory in Europe and victory in the Pacific. The country was at this point so broke that its war effort against Japan took on a mercenary tinge in the sense that London hoped to use the Pacific War as an opportunity to reduce war production and use any Lend-Lease supplies to boost exports. Naturally, the Americans weren't fans of Britain using materials meant to continue the war to instead revive its exports. But Morgenthau was willing for the American reaction not to be harsh, treating Britain as, in his words, a friend who is broke, with Washington making it possible to gradually revive trade and meet its obligations. White protested it wasn't America's job to do such a thing, since restoring British prosperity to any degree would threaten America's position in the post-war world. Roosevelt, who until that point apparently hadn't realized how impoverished Britain was, changed course and declared, "I had no idea that England was broke. I will go over there and make a couple of talks and take over the British Empire." Consequently, he reimposed export restrictions on Lend-Lease goods and cut the promised aid by $600 million, brushing aside Morgenthau's objections that it would violate the spirit of Quebec. Churchill wasn't bothered, convinced that if the program was insufficient, Roosevelt would come up with another wheeze, as he called it. The president had other ideas, suffering not a wheeze but a brain hemorrhage, dying on April 12, 1945. Much of Roosevelt's diplomacy had been based on informal chats or had been lost in his many stacks of papers, which meant Britain was left with the very unknown quantity of Harry Truman as president. On May 8, Germany surrendered and the war in Europe came to an end. Having sent only about a sixth of the Lend-Lease supplies arranged for 1945, the United States now clawed back the rest. One more pillar of the wartime alliance was knocked down in July when Churchill's Conservatives were decisively defeated by Attlee's Labour Party in the general election. The new government had a similar policy to the previous one in that they expected the second stage of Lend-Lease to allow them to start demobilizing the economy while the United States continued providing aid. Instead, on August 14th, Japan surrendered much sooner than expected. Truman abruptly ended Lend-Lease just 3 days later, a crippling blow to Britain's recovery plans. Keynes, sick and weakened, would be sent once more to negotiate with the Americans. What he got was the final blow to the empire.
Keynes, expecting a balance of payments deficit of $5.6 billion, announced the country faced a financial Dunkirk. And so, though by this point obviously ill, he was wheeled out one last time to negotiate with the Americans. The government hoped for a rebate of around $4 billion for British pre-Lend-Lease purchases from the United States, along with recognition that Britain was owed a moral debt for its war effort before American entry, apparently valued at $3 billion, according to one diplomat. Unsurprisingly, American officials were incredulous at the idea that after having rescued Britain in the war, they were still under some sort of moral obligation. British hopes for aid on such a basis, what Keynes called justice, were firmly shot down. The options open to the British then were to secure a loan from Washington or impose a brutal round of austerity at home. After some soul-searching, the cabinet reluctantly decided on the former, and Keynes suggested the United States offer an interest-free loan of $5 billion. American negotiator Clayton offered 2% interest instead. This was the best deal Britain was going to get, but Keynes didn't take it. Instead, his attention was diverted by a convoluted scheme from, of all people, his old rival White, which would see the United States buy up a large chunk of Britain's pound sterling debt, something that would leave London needing only $3 billion. The plan was implausible and was rejected by the White House, but almost comically served to convince the Americans that Keynes was exaggerating British poverty and didn't need $5 billion. He was told the offer was now $3.5 billion at 2% interest and $500 million to clean up Lend-Lease. Worse still, every time the British seemed ready to sign, American diplomats seemed to find a new concession they wanted in some forgotten corner. "Why do they chase us like this?" a depressed Keynes complained when the Americans pressed for more concessions on British transition rights under Bretton Woods. Eccles declared the United States needed guarantees it would have priority over Britain's other creditors. "You can't treat a great nation as though it were a bankrupt company," an enraged Keynes shot back. "No wonder that man's a Mormon," Keynes muttered privately. "No single woman could stand him." Despite all this, the eventual terms of the Anglo-American loan were generous, except in one respect. 2% interest over 50 years wasn't by any means exorbitant, though Keynes would remain bitter it wasn't interest-free for the rest of his life. In return, the Americans got an agreement for the elimination of exchange controls in just 1 year, and thus cemented their ultimate ascendancy over an empire that barely 30 years earlier had been the center of world finance. But this wouldn't be the last word in the Anglo-American relationship. What happened in the following years would reveal the true consequences of the decisions made at Bretton Woods. The British Empire wasn't destroyed by World War II or by American hostility per se. In fact, American intervention from December 1941 saved Britain from defeat and permanent impotence. But Bretton Woods ensured that America's hopes of keeping the empire weak and ultimately unsustainable succeeded. In the coming years, when the elimination of demanded exchange controls and British evacuations of their commitments in the Mediterranean showed how weak Britain really was, a massive reassessment of American policy toward the British Empire would occur. This reassessment would continue until the most serious rupture in Anglo-American relations since the Trent Affair, which would finally put an end to the great game between both powers. Churchill had imagined the alliance with the United States would be a partnership of equals, a brotherhood of Anglo-Saxon nations facing the challenges of the modern world together. What he got instead was a systematic and calculated transfer of economic and political power. Washington had grasped something London took years to accept. In the post-war world, there could only be one dominant empire. The supreme irony is that Britain survived World War II only to lose the peace that followed. The decisive battles weren't fought at Normandy or El Alamein, but in conference rooms at Bretton Woods and Washington. The generals won the military war, but the diplomats and economists determined who would rule the world that emerged from the ashes of the conflict. Keynes, the most brilliant man of his generation, had been outmaneuvered not by his lack of intelligence, but by his inability to grasp the fundamental nature of the negotiations he was involved in. This wasn't a debate between economic theories or financial systems. It was a struggle for global dominance, and Britain simply no longer had the cards to win that game. Drop a subscribe if this video changed your perspective on how world power was reconfigured after World War II, because every week I break down the diplomatic and economic battles that defined 20th century history and that official versions prefer to keep hidden.